So one of the questions that we get from our clients a lot is, how do we handle text message metadata? And one of the problems that we see a lot is that people are basing it on an old understanding of what text messages are. We see people fighting back and forth a lot over IMEI numbers being included in the metadata of the text message, account numbers, and an old spec of the type of metadata that used to exist as the primary resource when you used to go and access it from the actual providers. So what I want to talk about today is a little bit about how metadata works on text messaging when we talk about getting text messages from mobile devices, who you can get that from, where it can be stored, and what types of questions you should be asking of your forensic service provider, or how you should negotiate getting that information from the other side. So to start, what I want to talk about is the different places that this information can be stored. Now traditionally, when you talked about text messages, those text messages would be stored with your service providers. So for example, like Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile used to hold onto those text messages and then deliver them down to your phone. So in that case, those guys are the ones that you used to have to go to get your text messages if you didn't have it from the device. So they would actually store those messages for billing purposes. They would give you a bill that would show you all the people that you communicated with, all of the phone numbers that you texted with, and they'd be able to charge you 10 cents a message. And that's the old system of SMS that in some cases is still used today. But for the most part, people have migrated away from that service, and I'm going to talk about some of the ways that they've migrated off of those and how to deal with them. So if you're dealing with service provider-based text messaging, a lot of people think, oh, I'm just going to go to Verizon or AT&T or T-Mobile, and I'm just going to ask them for the text messages for that person. They don't like those types of requests, and they're actually trying to avoid storing the actual text messages themselves, although they may have the metadata about those text messages. So what does that mean? That means that you may be able to see who was being texted, who was receiving texts, who was being called, who was receiving calls, and how long the call duration would be. So that's the type of information that might exist over at your service provider. But if you actually want the content, if you want the most holistic version of those messages, you may not want to look just there, and you may not want to ask the person who is turning over the messages to give you just permission to go to those service providers, because they're probably not going to have the entire picture. Nowadays, people don't just text message with the standard SMS and MMS messaging. So when we talk about these guys over here, this is SMS. So this is what you would think of as a text message, okay? And then you have MMS, which is a multimedia message. So that's a picture or a video. So these service providers used to handle most of this type of text message sending. The problem with that is they used to charge money for it. You'd have to have either a plan per text, you'd have a plan per photo or video that you could send. They came up with some unlimited plans. Not everybody has that. So some of the service providers like Apple or WhatsApp or other text message service providers came up with other ways of giving the users the ability to have that same functionality on their phone without having to go over the paid MMS system. So now what you can do is you can go to the internet with your phone directly to a cloud database service. And if you have an iPhone and you see a message show up in green on your iPhone, that is likely going over the SMS service provider. If you have it show up in blue, and I don't have a blue marker, that's going over the Apple Cloud service. It's never actually touching Verizon, T-Mobile, and AT&T. Now people get confused by that because they say, well, wait a minute, the phone is getting its connection through the service provider. They use Verizon, so Verizon must have the text message. What's actually happening though is it's using the internet connection to create an encrypted pipeline to go over to Apple. And Apple is the one that's actually hosting those text messages in their cloud database. So it's not even touching Verizon. They have no concept of that text message at all. So if you have blue text messages and green text messages in one chat, and you just went and said, I want the metadata about it, you're probably just getting a part of that conversation. You're not getting the entire thing. The other thing that I see in these text message metadata requests is that people are basing a lot of these requests and demands on the old spec. And the old spec had certain metadata fields like IMEI number. Now what does that mean? every mobile device that connects out to a service provider has a unique identifier, so that service provider knows that that phone is on their network. And when it delivers an SMS or an MMS, it goes to that IMEI number of that device that has been activated on their network. So when you talk about SMS and MMS, then yeah, the IMEI number could be relevant because it determines which device was sending or receiving the message. The problem is, you're not always going to have that metadata to produce, and if you're demanding that type of metadata, you could actually be missing a lot of the new metadata that's been created by some of the newer services. So some things that are not supported by the old system are some of the animated GIF files that are being sent right now, some of the higher quality images that are being sent, videos. When you would send it over the Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile MMS system, they would have to be converted into an MMS format and sent completely differently than they're sent over these new databases. So you could have all this additional metadata, even the original metadata of the photo or the video could be included now, and you may want to get that information as well. So focusing on the old metadata fields is not a great idea. You don't want to specify and say, I want exactly this metadata fields, otherwise you could be missing the broader scope of it. You don't necessarily want to go and just collect SMS databases because maybe they're not even using that. I see a lot of people who barely use iMessage or barely use MMS, and they're only in the cloud-based databases. So you want to look at those alternate sources and make sure that you're being very broad with what your requests are and that you understand the nature of how this information is stored, because we're looking at multiple sources here, and sometimes you do need to aggregate them. So there are times where you may need to get some metadata from the service provider in terms of who contacted who, call duration, things like that, if it's not on the phone. But the phone has its own local database. You may want to look at that. You may want to look at the cloud services because maybe it's not on the phone anymore, but maybe it's synchronized to the cloud. And in addition to that, some of these cloud databases also sync down to other devices. You could have a laptop that has text messages on it because it's synced up from the phone and then synced back like this. So you want to be holistic in terms of how you approach the type of text message collection and where this type of metadata is stored, but also how you request it. So just keep that in mind and don't stick to a rigid format and say, I want IMEI numbers and account numbers. You want to say, I want as much metadata as you're able to get for me for the different platforms, and I want to know which platforms are being used for communication. In addition to all of this stuff, you want to keep in mind that there are going to be certain types of communication platforms that don't easily allow export. What I mean is, like, there are certain types of encrypted applications that people are using now where the local database is encrypted. It's made to not be extractable in a backup or through some external means. And in those situations, you may want to contract somebody who can look into the device a little bit more forensically if that's necessary, or you may have to try to figure out how to get those things off of on a per instance setup. So it's just something to keep in mind, and you have to stay up to date on all of the latest technologies as they're coming out and understand where all of this information could sit. Okay, Nikolai, do the outro for me.
All right, thank you, Danie. And thank you guys for watching. If you got any questions for Danie, put them in the comment section below. Don't forget to check us out on social media networks listed on your screen. And for more videos, check us out on YouTube. Thank you for watching.